This is World Insight. I'm Tian. Over the weekend, the trade and investment ministers coming from G20 economies gathered and put forward their statement, suggesting about the united role against COVID-19. Measures include a short-term effort to lift the coronavirus economic gloom and a long-term goal to support WTO reforms and multilateral trade. They also seek to firm up global supply chains and shore up international investments. But the Trump administration moved to block global chip supplies to blacklisted telecom company Huawei over the weekend, which is considered as another worrisome setback. So where does all of this lead us to? Can trade and investment help to save lives or block the way? I asked those questions to Jeffrey Schott from Peterson Institute. You've been working and following very closely China-U.S. trade conflict recently. Tell me more about the decision made by the U.S. side to blacklist Huawei and China's response. What does that mean?
Well, it means that the fears that we had last year are coming to pass, that bilateral relations are becoming more difficult, and this is being exhibited not only because of the continuation of the trade tariffs from the trade war, but also on the restrictions on investment, particularly in the high-tech sector. And we were worried about that deepening. It has affected very dramatically Chinese investment in the United States, and the new measures introduced are designed to restrict the flow from the United States of technologies and products that can be shipped directly or indirectly to China.
There is supposed to be a 120-day grace period. What would we be able to do in order to even take back the spilled water?
Well, these measures affect both Chinese firms and U.S. firms. And so there is a lot at stake. Right now, the White House seems to be making its decisions based on national security considerations that have not been fully vetted with the public. So it's hard to make an assessment of their actions. But there is an opportunity for firms to go and seek either exceptions or modifications in what is still today an interim rule. So it is in place, but it is temporary and can be modified. And hopefully for both commercial and political reasons it will be.
At this point, though, we are seeing the pandemic still spreading and causing great concern in the U.S. Do you think American businesses will be able to be, up on their feet, be able to fight for their own interests, even though this is more targeting on Huawei, but certainly going to have a big impact on both sides?
Well, the political context has become much more complicated. And especially as we are only months away from a presidential election, and President Trump seems to be putting more and more emphasis on his criticism and opposition to Chinese practices to differentiate himself from Vice President Biden. It doesn't look favorable for a dramatic improvement in U.S.-China relations in the coming months because, frankly, the term in the United States is China has become a political football in the election campaign. And President Trump will use the concern and the fears about Chinese competition to try to win votes for his reelection.
Is there a way of so-called taking back the spilled water to manage the damage at least before the election so that things could be a bit better after it?
Well, we do need to manage the damage that is being done. because we both need to work together to deal with both the consequences of the pandemic and the preparations that will be needed to prepare for the next iteration of crises that will come in this area. Obviously, international planning was not sufficient, both in both our countries and in the World Health Organization. And we need to work together to ensure that there aren't disruptions in needed production and supply, distribution of needed medical equipment and medicines. It will be particularly important to work together, hopefully when we have developed a vaccine, to ensure that the vaccine is available to all our peoples and can be distributed around the world to some of the poorest countries of the world. Because a global pandemic will come back and hurt the United States and hurt China if we don't control it everywhere. And so it is critical that we engage in the type of global cooperation that seems to be increasingly difficult as political rhetoric escalates in our bilateral relations. And that's something we have to worry about because it is inconsistent with the needs of that have been voiced by the G20 for global competition. That's something we have to keep in mind even as the United States goes through its presidential election campaign in the coming months.
Talking about the G20, Mr. Schott, you know very well over the weekend the G20 investment and trade ministers put out eventually a statement which is supposed to be applauded by everybody because it's been through a lot of hard work. Do you think there's much that we should really look into? I know you've been writing articles and been talking about the expectations people should have from these ministers.
Well, I think the ministers this week went a little further than was done in March when the ministers and the G20 leaders got together to address the immediate crisis caused by the pandemic. At that time, did little more than agree that they would continue to do what they were already doing and that they could continue to exercise their rights under the World Trade Organization to restrict imports or exports if it was absolutely necessary and was temporary. But what we have found out since then is that's not enough. There needs to be greater certainty that trade and investment will not be interrupted, that production will be encouraged, and that the supplies of needed medical equipment, therapeutics, medical supplies, will be available both at home and abroad, because we need to deal with this pandemic both within our own borders and in our neighbors and trading partners, because we know that the transmission of the virus goes out and can come back in. And so that's why the G20 had to go beyond what it did 2 months ago. It made a small progress in that area.
In that statement, they talk about two things. One, of course, is short term, as you just illustrated, how to coordinate, cooperate, and mitigate the impact of COVID-19 related to trade and investment. And longer term is about a reform of the WTO, the necessary discussions about that. But even for the short term, Jeffrey, let me go a little bit further about it. We have seen confusions as a result of different standards, even about the PPE, for example, and also the difficulties of the aviation industry relating to the shipping of goods to the necessary parts of the world, and to see the relation between contractors and also those manufacturers been changing as situations evolve every day. So these are all complicated issues. How can the ministers or the different bodies be able to coordinate on all of these very important details?
Well, it's difficult because they're dealing in a national political context and they're dealing with international necessities and relationships that have to be maintained in order to have the cooperation needed to source the supplies that are so important for national production. What we found in the United States is we couldn't block sales of certain medicines and pharmaceuticals because needed components to produce those pharmaceuticals in the United States came from other countries, and they would block our access to those goods if we restricted their trade. What we have to find is a better way of ensuring that there are adequate supplies and much greater stockpiles of these of medical equipment and medicines than we had before, because we know that a pandemic like the COVID-19 creates a massive strain on health systems in our countries and worldwide. So that's what the G20 should be doing. They should be renouncing the use of export controls and rather find a way of working together to ensure that there are incentives to ramp up production when it's needed and do it on a very urgent basis.
While the trade conflicts go on, the fate of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, is becoming ever more unpredictable, particularly with its Director General resigning 1 year before his term comes to an end. Roberto Azevedo, the WTO Director General, has been a proponent of international cooperation. Since late last year, the WTO's operation has been severely compromised because its appellate body has been crippled by the Trump administration, which refused to approve nominees to fill vacancies on that crucial appeals panel. So, what's at stake? I asked Jeffrey Schott about that question too. Let me move on to another topic about the WTO. The Director General of the WTO, Azevedo, have expressed that he will resign 1 year before his term comes to an end, out of frustration that the WTO will not be able to do anything, and there are a lot of geopolitical fights behind the scenes. Tell me more, Mr. Schott, about what does that mean for the immediate future of World Trade Organization. Can they still function?
Well, the World Trade Organization is a member-driven organization, so the Director General and the Secretariat act as basically serve the member countries. That said, they can provide very important guidance and leadership to promote constructive negotiations between the member countries and to ensure that existing agreements are adequately implemented and enforced. And I think what Roberto Azevedo has concluded is that with the blockage of the appellate body, which has essentially been disabled since the end of last year, with no prospect for big negotiations between the member countries, in part because of political frictions between major trading nations, and the pandemic, which makes it very difficult for trade negotiators to get together, even virtually, to build the type of foundations for new agreements. So we've seen the international WTO subsidy talks on fisheries basically stalled in recent weeks. All of this means that he wouldn't have had much to do, and the process for selecting his successor would have started later this fall in any event. So his decision to resign only pushes up 4 or 5 months the process that would have started in selecting a new Director General that would take office in September 2021. Essentially, in the interim, until a new Director General is selected, the deputy director generals will guide the Secretariat in the limited tasks that they still have ongoing. One of the reasons why Acevedo felt it was important to leave a little earlier is to hopefully get a new director general named by early next year, so that he or she, probably she, could be intimately involved in the preparations for the next WTO ministerial, which has now been moved back to June of 2021. And so I think that was one of his considerations, and I suspect that members will, WTO members will try to select a new director general by the end of this year, if possible.
And finally, Mr. Schott, as we speak, the World Health Assembly is ongoing on Monday and Tuesday with the WHO and its member countries involved. How do you think it is likely to be more intertwined, the nature of trade and the nature of public health, as a result of COVID-19 and the uncertainties it's still having on our lives? People talk about the second, third, and even more waves regarding the virus. Mr. Schott.
That's a very good question. And actually, the WTO has had a long-standing debate and work on access to medicines. And this has been going on for almost 2 decades. And it's the COVID-19 pandemic just puts a spotlight on the need to move forward with that work, which has not progressed very quickly. It involves both the issues of intellectual property and the ability not only to patent, but also to broadly license new medicines and therapeutics, so that not only the home country, but also many other countries can produce and distribute the goods where the products where they are needed to deal with the pandemic. This involves a mixture of intellectual property, trade, and investment regulations that will have to be revisited in light of the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the trade and financial officials who are dealing with the commercial side of the story need to be well informed by the medical experts, the epidemiologists and the virologists who understand what needs to be done to have a secure action or to remedy the pandemic. That's going to take some time, but the major trading nations really need to get together now, and the G20 is only scratching on the edges of what needs to be done to integrate the intellectual property, the access to medicines issues more broadly, and the trade and investment rules to ensure that they work more seamlessly to ensure access to medicines and proper sufficient production of those medicines and adequate distribution to all countries, rich and poor.
Well said, Mr. Schott. Related to that final question, this seems to be what you have just said, an opportunity of cooperation. How optimistic are you in terms of whether we are going to grasp this opportunity to cooperate, led by the scientists, led by the epidemiologists, and led by the virologists, and of course the trade officials?
Well, I think you're seeing a great improvement in that cooperation among most countries in the world. And the area of problem remains because of the friction in the U.S.-China relationship that has been caused by the trade war of the past couple of years. I think what we need is a recognition that dealing with this virus is more important, and finding ways of working together to stomp it out is more important than some of the trade frictions that we've had that have been the subject of so many of your programs and so many headlines. But I'm not confident that that's likely to happen as we ramp up a presidential campaign in the United States that seems to be moving to much more negative rhetoric and much more China bashing like we saw earlier in the Trump administration. So I wish I could be more optimistic, but I suspect we're not going to see an improvement in U.S.-China relations that is needed in the near term, and hopefully after the election we can have a resetting of that relationship.
Jeffrey Schott, always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you for inviting me.
My interview with Jeffrey Schott from Peterson Institute. That's all we have for today's program. If you would like to see more, certainly search us on the internet. Meanwhile, you can also follow us on YouTube channel, our Facebook and Twitter accounts. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.